Hello everyone, and for today's video I wanted to do a little bit of a topic video on media choice based on orchids and environment. So it's not as bad as some topics like water culture or pH level in orchids, or in orchid media, but it is pretty much up there. And so what I'm trying to do here is just talk about why I choose the media as I do and the methods I use to gauge which media is best for which orchid in what environment. And so that's purely what I'm saying. It's not what you necessarily have to do. It's not what anybody has to do. It's just what I do in order to pick my media and my pot and like everything like that, and know what I want to do and how I want to grow them. So the first one I want to look at here is this is my Coryanthes macrantha. It was shipped to me and the leaves had to get trimmed. I was sad about that, but it's growing strongly in its new growth and got some new roots growing as well. So Coryanthes is a species this is Coryanthes macrantha, as I said. This is a species that likes a lot of water and drinks it very quickly and grows very quickly. So what I chose as a media choice here was primarily moss. There's moss, especially it's solid moss on the top layer, but once it get under the surface layer, it's a mixture of moss and fine grade bark to keep it a little fluffy, but also moisture retentive. Because this species sucks it all up in like a week or less. And I just watered it recently, so that's why it's still wet. But the reason I chose that is even though my humidity is high, this orchid still needs to stay moist. So I chose a mossy mix, but not fully moss, so that if there were any rot issues, it was minimalized. And it's sitting in this little plastic tray as well that I can fill up and let soak up the water from. And so that one, it's a very easygoing one. So that's good about that. Now the next one is my Bulbophyllum Mean Kingdom Warriors. I did a spotlight on this one very close to the founding of my channel. And so this one, in case anybody was wondering, because I'll update it while I'm here, see if I can get to focus. That is actually turning out to be a spike. It's got this bulb shape on the bottom and even started a root on the other side. I don't think it's going to show up though, it's too dark. But there is absolutely and totally a bud showing up there, and and the next sheath is growing for the next bud. So that's cool. It's going to be blooming again. Second time sparking and the second bloom of the plant. The previous bloom, which happened on this bulb here, was the first bloom of the plant. It was the first bloom seedling. I gave it the clone name Zia Solaris after the state that I'm living in, New Mexico. And it's got lots of new growth, but this one, it's a bulbophyllum. It's a small bulbophyllum. Lasiochyllum, its pod parent, is a smaller growing bulbophyllum, and mandibulare is a bit larger, but quite a bit larger actually. But Lasiochyllum keeps that size down a lot, so you can see just how big it is. Bulbophyllums tend to like to stay evenly moist or suck up water slowly over a long period. So for this one, I chose a very chunky but also very moisture retentive mix of half fine grade Orchiata and half chopped sphagnum moss. And so that keeps it fluffy, keeps a little bit of aeration to the roots, but also holds a little bit more moisture. And it's got a thick layer of charcoal and large chunk bark on the bottom for extra drainage and aeration. And so this one, the moisture retentive mix and the moisture desires of the plant are what influenced me to pick that media. If I could have done just moss, but in a bigger pot like this, and even though it's not too big, it's like 3.5 inches, even in this size pot, using a pure moss mixture can result in rot for me because I grow in a humid environment. So I have to choose a bit more aeration to the roots rather than a little bit more on the moisture retention, because it's going to hold a little bit more water for longer anyway. So that's that one. Put that one aside. The next one I want to look at, this is a Cattleya species. This is a miniature Cattleya species. This is Cattleya nubilar. I got this one from Norman's Orchids as well. These two were the older bulbs, and these two are the newest, and they're plump and happy, and the roots look pretty good. These are the older two leaves. It's a bifoliate, so it's very picky about repotting. But this one, because it's a species that likes a lot of air to the roots, likes to dry fast, and likes frequent watering. So what I did with this one is I potted it in coarse grade Orchiata, which includes charcoal and perlite, in a slotted clear pot, so it gets lots of air to the roots. And you can see it's actually got a new roots growing right there. Let's see if I can get to focus on it. There we go. There's a new root growing right there. But both of these bulbs are in growth. There's one growth there, and there's the other growth there. See if I can get to focus. There we go. And so this one, like I said, liking a lot more air, I chose a chunkier mix because with the high humidity, it's going to stay wet still for a good amount of time before it fully dries out. And the humidity also gets through to the roots when it's dry, and that helps out the roots quite a bit. And so the cool thing about this species is that it stays small and the internodal length isn't very large, but it blooms off the rhizome, just because I'm looking at it. As you can see here, there's this stub right here. That was a spike. This bulb grew this spike, and then it grew this growth from there. This species, Nobler and Walkeriana, are the two species of Cattleya that bloom from the rhizome like this, rather than the apex of the pseudobulb between the leaves. And so that's a little bit an interesting one, but that one required a very, very aerated mix. So this one, it's not a happy looking plant. I'm not going to pretend it is. This was a Lowe's rescue that was in bad shape, so that's why it looks sad, but I planted it up not long ago. It's potted in a fine grade chunk fine or orchid bark mix. And the reason I chose that is because Phalaenopsis likes some air to the roots, but especially in this tender of a shape where it's not in the best conditions because of how it was grown in the store. It needs a little bit more TLC and a little bit more careful watering. So I gave it a fine grade bark so that I can give it a little bit more water, have it stay a little bit more wet for a while, but still have good airflow. And so it's potted in a nice spot. It didn't have a bad root system, it just lost a bunch of its roots that it did have. And so this kind of bark, there's a little bit of chunk bark in there that I put in there just for kicks. But it's otherwise a very moisture retentive, but also very aerated, yet not overly so, mix. The next one I want to look at is, and I've shown this one as well before, this is the Bulbophyllum leveni, mounted to the suet cage. So the media for this one, it's just solid moss in there. What I did when I mounted it is I hooked the plant and strapped it down to the sides of the little hole I cut out in the metal, and filled in moss around the roots and the cage. And so that's how this thing's pounded. It's just pure moss all the way through, but as you can see, it's open on all sides, so it dries out very quickly, and the plant soaks up the water very quickly. It's on the dry side right now. It's actually due for a watering tomorrow, but it's still damp to the touch. But because of the moss, it holds water for a good amount of time, and Bulbophyllums love that. As I think that's why it's grown so much, is because it started out with just 4 bulbs, and then being able to suck up water for a long period of time, slowly, it allowed it to be able to grow a lot. And so we've got a new growth maturing here, a new growth growing here, right behind here, a new eye right there. And so the moss was a good choice for this because, again, it's a Bulbophyllum. It likes to stay a little bit wet for longer to soak up that water. And I also give it light feedings with every watering. And so that's the cool thing to remember about Bulbophyllums is whatever you mix you choose, you want it to be fairly moisture retentive. It depends on the pot and the species, of course, or the hybrid, but in a general rule, you want it to be a more moisture retentive mix with still some good airflow and air exposure. The next one I didn't want to take down because it was up here. So this one is my Bulbophyllum Elizabeth Ann. I'm not going to say that this one's in perfect shape either because the older bulbs are shriveling a little bit. The newer ones are growing and they're doing pretty well. It's a massive growth right there. But this is a hybrid of Rothschildianum and Longissimum, and so it's in a giant 6-inch pot. The root system was massive. So I chose, because the pot was so large, I chose a chunk or medium to large grade or coarse grade rather Orchiata with a little bit of moss on the top and mixed throughout, and that way it has a lot of airflow, but it's also very moisture retentive because it is a larger pot, and so it is going to hold water for longer. And the leaves, they look good. So I'm hoping this plant will plump up a little bit more because it did this almost like it was not fully plump when I got it either, but it was a good plant. It was worth the money. I only paid 25 for it. Or no, actually I paid 15 for it because I was gonna pay 25, but I got a discount. So that one, it's a special case because it's a much larger pot. At the size of the pot, even the coarse bark stays wet for a while. And so then here's another one. This is my Cattleya tigrina. This one's potted in what looks like a similar to Orchiata kind of mix without the perlite. It's a species that likes a lot of airflow as well, and it's also a bifoliate. So it prefers a lot of air to the roots, likes to dry out quickly, so that one's potted in a bark. And then you'll see as you look around, like a bunch of my plants are, when I'll focus again. A bunch of my plants are potted in various ways. My Bulbophyllum phalaenopsis seedling right there is potted in a mossy bark mix. My Schilleriana up there is potted in a fine grade bark mix. The mounted ones obviously aren't potted in anything, but this one has a little bit of natural moss growing around it, the Euchili Marii. And some of them that are mounted have moss, like that one has moss. The Dendrobium legesii over there has moss. The Phalaenopsis and Dendrobium tontuanii also have some moss on them to various degrees. The Ingraecium here, and Ingraeciums are very picky about repotting at all stages of development, so you got to be careful when you do it, and after a certain point you don't want to do it at all because you'll kill the plant. They're that picky. But this one's potted in a chunky bark mix that is mostly gone at this point. It's massive roots in there. I'm going to have to sink this pot into a larger one because I can't repot it. And then the seedlings, most of the seedlings are doing pretty well. They're potted in a seedling mix of chopped sphagnum moss and fine grade bark, mixed so that they get some airflow, but it also holds water a little bit longer. And the catasetums up here in the dark, they're potted in pure moss with a little bit of bark or styrofoam on bottom because it keeps the drainage going well. My Bellina here is potted in a mix of coarse grade bark and looks like some moss in there. This Phalaenopsis is potted in a fine grade bark mix, and it's in bloom actually. This is a rescue that I got a few years back and finally got to bloom. It didn't bloom very many flowers, which is disappointing, and this one's opening now. But it's a massive plant. You can see how big it is, and it's got a nice new root growing there, but it's a massive plant, a massive root system. That's a 4-inch pot, and it's tall. So overall, it really just depends on your environment. If I was growing indoors, and since I live in a desert, the high desert of central New Mexico, it's very dry. And so if I was to grow, say I wanted to grow a Bulbophyllum in a pot, I wouldn't choose a bark and moss mix. I would probably go with straight moss because it would aerate fat enough and it would dry out fairly quickly, but still stay moist long enough. But because it's dry, the dry air is drier, the media dries out faster. And for things like this, like I probably wouldn't be able to do this very well. It would need watering daily, or even less at the rate that it's being watered right now. And so others like the like I would have to choose maybe fine grade bark for the Nobloir here because it would be too dry and it would air out too quickly. But it just depends on your environment. The drier your air, the more moisture retentive the mix you want to pick. The more humid your environment, let's say you live in a tropical area or you're growing in a greenhouse like I am, even if the humidity is 50%, you have a much higher humidity than some people have, and most growers I know of anyway have, and so you want to be very cautious about what media you pick. And we'll get to this in a future episode, but in my honest opinion, water does not need to be a media. I don't believe orchids should be grown in water. I have an experiment growing in water, but that's just because it's an experiment. I'm seeing how it reacts in my conditions, but I don't believe water is something that you should grow orchids in. People do it. Do I agree with it? Honestly, no. Am I going to tell them to stop? I shouldn't. No, but I'm not even going to bother anyway because because they're probably doing it for their own personal reasons. In a house environment, water culture does tend to be a little bit more useful because you can keep the orchids more watered and the humidity up around them a little bit more. But we'll get into it in a future episode as to why I truly don't believe water culture is viable and usable. But back to the topic that we're talking about. The media choice is crucial for the success of your orchid. So you have to analyze your environment, analyze the plant, what is it like, where does it come from. A species obviously is going to be where it comes from, but you can also look at hybrids and look at their parentage. Because Nobloire comes from, the Cattleya Nobloire, it's behind me, comes from an environment where it dries out for a while over winter as like a kind of pseudo rest period, and then lots of water during the growth period. And so naturally you're going to want it to be dry and aerated in the winter as well as in the summer while it's being watered a lot. Whereas a catasetum goes completely dormant as well and gets almost no water during the winter. It only gets like the mist and fog in its natural environment. So those, I pot them in moss because they are thirsty plants and they grow fast. So I can afford to grow them in moss and but as long as I'm careful about it, I usually give a big aerated pot, like a nice aerated pot, holes around it, holes on bottom. My preference is air cone pots, which is what this one is potted in, because there's a cone on the bottom. If I take a look at it right there, that goes up into the middle of the pot and brings air up to the middle of the pot, and that's especially useful in my greenhouse because you can see, as I see here, that it's a grate, so they can sit on top of it and air can get under the pots. And so that's what I do with those. It's pure moss, because in the winter time you can keep the moss fully dry and it's difficult to wet because it's dry. And then when they start growing, you can water it slowly and get the moss to soak up water again, and then pretty soon you're off to the races, keeping them practically moist all year round, or not year round, all growing season. So once again, cannot stress enough, please do analyze your growing conditions, because that does matter and what media you choose and what pot choice you make. All my pots are plastic because clay pots, I don't like them. The roots tend to stick to the pots and don't come out easily. And baskets are also something I'm looking into, but these cages are pretty cool too, because once I'm done with it, if I don't need the cage for anything, I just cut the cage off, pull the plant out, put it where I need to put it. But this, so far, it's growing well, and the moss is doing a fantastic job for it. But yeah, analyze your conditions, make sure you choose the media and pot of your choice. Now, a quick little look at the media that I have, and it's all hidden in places, so I apologize because you're going to see the messy corner of the greenhouse where I stock supplies. So you can see the moss right here. It's upside down, but that's Better Grow orchid moss. It's fantastic stuff. They sell it at my Lowe's for $5 a bale, and they're pretty big bales. Then there's my bags of Orchiata sitting right there. There's my fine grade on top, as well as my wire. And then in here is a bale of moss that I already opened up. It's dry in there. I just reach in, grab a handful, chop it up, mix it up, wet it, and you're good to go. And so those are the medias I keep in here. I also have, hiding over here, a bag of coarse grade Guller's orchid mix, which is a fantastic for Cattleyas and bigger Phalaenopsis. And so I mix them typically. I'll usually grab like a handful of Orchiata, add a little bit of moss, depending on the plant. There's some these are Psychopsis seedlings. It went out of focus again. Psychopsis seedlings. They're in a fine grade bark mix with a little bit of moss mixed in the top layer, because they like to stay aerated but retain a little bit more moisture. So I'll mix these mixtures up, and I've mentioned a few of them, like the Coryanthes there. Oops, I dropped the phone. Apologies for that. But they're just mixes, really. This fowl is potted in a mix of fine grade and a little bit of bark. They're all just mixtures, because I like to fine tune to the plant's needs and not just do a general, oh, this plant likes water, fine grade bark or moss. This plant doesn't like a lot of water, coarse grade. I don't do that. I mix it. If a plant likes a lot of air to the roots but a little bit more moisture retention, I'll mix a coarse grade with some moss, but I'll leave the moss whole strands. I chop it up because it blends better with the media if I'm stirring it and mixing it together. But in a bigger chunk, the moss will just fall to the bottom. So that's how I handle that. So I hope that helps everyone. Please do comment below if you have any questions about my media choices, what I use it for, and exactly anything really. And I will be happy to respond. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video.